Marietta Kestrel was 54 years old, and on the morning this story begins, she owned nothing. No roof, no bed, no coin beyond what fit in a cracked tobacco tin. Her husband's own brother, Ezra Kestrel, had put her off the homestead she'd scrubbed and planted for 26 years. Waving a deed that named him heir the moment Thomas drew his last breath, and the banker who'd co-signed that eviction, a soft-spoken man named Silas Renwick, had smiled the whole while he did it. She left with $11.40, a carpet bag, and her mother's sewing shears. 3 days later, at a dust-choked courthouse auction in the dying rail town of Sable Flats, Wyoming Territory, while grown men laughed behind their hands, she raised that same trembling fist and bought the condemned old stagecoach depot at the edge of town for $9, a building so forgotten even the pigeons had left it. It seemed the last foolish act of a ruined woman. But sealed behind the depot's boarded ticket window slept something that no one in Sable Flats had dared speak of in 18 years. A confession that would not only change what remained of Marietta's life, but hand a wounded town back its stolen name. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Marietta Kestrel. If you are watching this from a place the world has written off as finished, tell us where you're from in the comments. We'd like to know you're still there. Marietta had been born Marietta Doyle in the spring of 1832 in a cabin at the edge of a Missouri hardwood forest that her father cleared himself, tree by stubborn tree, before she was old enough to remember him whole. Her mother, Constance Doyle, was a seamstress of some regional fame, a woman who could look at a bolt of cloth and see, the way other women saw weather coming, exactly what it wanted to become. It was from her mother that Marietta learned the trade that would carry her through most of her life, not merely the stitching, though her hands grew sure and fast at that, but something harder to name, the habit of looking closely at things other people had stopped looking at. Constance used to say that cloth never lied to you if you paid attention to it, that a worn hem or a mended cuff could tell you the whole history of the person who wore it, if you were patient enough to read it. She said the same of houses, of tools, of land gone to seed, that neglect was not the same thing as worthlessness, and that the two were confused constantly, by people too impatient or too proud to look twice. Marietta married Thomas Kestrel in 1852, when she was 20 years old, in a small Methodist church in Independence before the family moved west along the emigrant roads with a wagon train bound, eventually, for the high grass country of the Wyoming Territory. Thomas was a blacksmith by trade, broad through the shoulders and slow to anger, a man who believed that iron, like people, could be bent true if you were willing to heat it patiently and strike it with care rather than force. They settled a homestead outside Sable Flats in 1859, back when the town was young and hopeful, back when the stagecoach line still ran silver payroll through twice a month and the depot at the edge of town was the busiest building for 80 miles in any direction. Marietta took in sewing and mending for the stage line's passengers and the town's ranching families. And slowly, the way a creek cuts a canyon, she built a modest reputation as a woman whose work you could trust with your Sunday coat or your daughter's wedding dress. They never had children of their own, a grief they carried quietly and without complaint, the way people of that generation carried most griefs, folded small and tucked away where visitors wouldn't see them. Instead, they took in what stray creatures came their way, an orphaned ranch hand one winter, a widow's boy who needed teaching in the forge the next, and Marietta came to believe, over the slow accumulation of years, that a family was less a matter of blood than a matter of who you chose to keep close and feed. Thomas used to tease her that she'd taken in more broken things in their marriage than the church poor box, and she'd tell him that broken things were simply things nobody had bothered to fix yet, and that she intended to go on fixing what she could for as long as her hands allowed it. It was, though neither of them knew it at the time, a philosophy that would matter enormously many years later, when she stood alone in front of a condemned building that everyone else in Sable Flats had long since decided was past saving. Thomas Kestrel died in the winter of 1885, of a fever that came on fast and hard during a season when the roads were too choked with snow to fetch a doctor from the county seat in time. Marietta nursed him herself for 11 days, boiling willow bark and sitting up through the nights with a lamp turned low. And when he finally went, in the gray hour just before dawn, she was holding his hand and had not slept in longer than she could remember. She was 53 years old, and she believed, in her grief, that the worst of her trouble was behind her. She could not have been more wrong, and it is here that the story turns toward its harder chapters, the ones that made the discovery waiting for her all the more remarkable when at last it came. The trouble began within a month of the burial. When Ezra Kestrel arrived from Cheyenne with a lawyer's letter and a look on his face that Marietta had seen before, on men who had already decided something and were only waiting for the paperwork to catch up to their intentions. Thomas, it turned out, had never formally transferred the homestead. Deed into both their names, an oversight, common enough among frontier couples too busy surviving to think much about legal particulars, and under a family agreement, drawn up decades earlier by Thomas and Ezra's late father. The land reverted to the eldest surviving Kestrel son upon Thomas's death, provided all debts against the property were clear. And there, conveniently, was where Silas Renwick entered the story, holding a promissory note that Thomas had signed 3 winters prior against a bad cattle year, a note Marietta had never known existed. A note that Renwick's bank now called due in full, payable, as it happened, only by surrendering what claim she might otherwise have pressed to the land. She went to the bank herself. In a dress she'd mended so many times the seams had their own history, and she asked Silas Renwick plainly whether there was not some arrangement to be made. Some way a woman who had lived and worked that land for 26 years might be allowed to keep even a corner of it. Renwick was a young man, not yet 40, with the kind of politeness that never once warmed into kindness, and he told her, with real regret in his voice that did not reach his eyes, that business was business, and that he was certain a resourceful woman such as herself would land on her feet. She would remember for the rest of her life the particular cruelty of being told she was resourceful in the very breath that stripped her of everything her resourcefulness had built. By the end of that month, she had been moved off the homestead entirely, her furniture sold at a loss to cover what remained of the note, her tools distributed among Ezra's wagons, her garden left to whatever animals cared to have it. She took a room above the mercantile for as long as her savings allowed, mended clothes for whoever would hire her, and watched, with the particular clarity of a woman who has lost the luxury of illusions, as the town of Sable Flats itself continued its own long, slow decline, a decline that had begun, she now recalled, some 18 years earlier, when the stagecoach line rerouted around the town entirely following a scandal nobody discussed above a whisper, and the railroad, when it finally came through the territory, chose a different crossing 11 miles north, leaving Sable Flats to wither the way towns wither when the roads that fed them are taken away. It was in this state, penniless, recently widowed, evicted from the only home she'd known in a quarter century, that Marietta found herself standing outside the county courthouse on an auction morning in early April of 1886, watching the sheriff sell off tax-forfeited properties to whoever would take them off the county's hands. Most of the lots went for a few dollars to men who wanted the land and cared nothing for what stood on it. And then the auctioneer read out the final item of the day, the old stagecoach depot, boarded and condemned, sitting on its half-acre at the western edge of town. Unused since 1868, structurally sound according to the county surveyor, but not worth the paper the deed was printed on, in the opinion of everyone gathered. Nobody bid. The auctioneer called for an opening offer twice, and both times the only answer was the wind moving through the empty street and a ripple of quiet laughter among the men who'd come mostly to watch each other. Marietta, who by her own later admission could not entirely explain what moved her, raised her hand and offered $9, the whole of what remained in her tobacco tin save $1.40 she kept back for bread. The sheriff, more amused than skeptical, banged his gavel and pronounced it sold, and a ripple of laughter went through the crowd. That Marietta absorbed the way she'd absorbed most things that year, by holding her spine straight and saying, "Nothing at all." She walked the half-mile out to the depot that same afternoon, key in hand, and stood a long while simply looking at it before she went inside. It was a low, long building of gray clapboard and fieldstone chimney, its porch sagging at one corner where the post had rotted through, its windows boarded except for the one facing the old coach yard, which had been bricked over entirely rather than boarded. An oddity she noticed but did not yet understand. Inside, the dust lay thick enough to hold the shape of footprints 18 years old, and the old waiting benches were furred gray with cobweb, and the potbelly stove sat cold and rusted in the corner, where some long-departed station-master had last banked its coals. It smelled of mice and old varnish, and faintly of tobacco smoke gone stale beyond memory. Marietta walked its length slowly, the way her mother had taught her to walk toward any piece of cloth or any piece of land that other people had already decided was worthless, looking for what it wanted to become, rather than what it currently was. It was near the old ticket counter that she found the first thing that gave her pause. Not the counter itself, which was ordinary enough. A plain pine barrier with a brass grill worn dull, but the wall behind it, where the ticket window that should have opened onto the platform had been bricked over from the inside with a neatness that no weather damage could account for. Someone had done this deliberately and carefully, and had then papered over the brickwork with the same faded floral wallpaper that lined the rest of the office wall, as though hoping no one would ever look closely enough to notice the seam. Marietta noticed. She had spent 30 years reading the histories hidden in cloth, and this wall, she understood at once, was a garment someone had altered to hide something they didn't want found. She did not have the tools that first afternoon to open the wall, and in truth she was not entirely certain she should. But she came back the next morning with a hammer and cold chisel borrowed from the blacksmith who'd once been Thomas's apprentice, and she worked at the bricked seam for the better part of 2 hours, prying loose mortar gone brittle with age, until at last a section of brick came free in her hands, and she found herself looking into a shallow cavity behind the old ticket window, a space perhaps 2 feet deep, dry as a bone, undisturbed since the day it had been sealed. Inside sat a battered strongbox, unlocked, and atop it, wrapped in oilskin gone stiff and yellow, a thick bundle of papers tied with a leather cord. She carried the bundle to the window light with hands that had gone unsteady, and untied the cord, and began to read, and what she read there kept her sitting on the dusty floor of that condemned depot until the light failed, and she had to finish by lamp. The papers were the confession of a man named Obadiah Finch, who had served as station master of the Sable Flats depot from 1861 until the autumn of 1868, and who had written in a small, careful hand that grew increasingly urgent across the pages, an account of what had truly happened to the stage, lined silver payroll on the night of September the 14th of that year, the very robbery whose scandal had driven the coach line to reroute around the town and had begun, though few in Sable Flats connected the two events even now, the town's long slide into its present state of forgottenness. Finch wrote that the robbery had never been the work of masked strangers, as the official account claimed, but had been arranged from within the depot itself, at the instruction of a man named Bartholomew Renwick, founder of the very bank that stood in Sable Flats to this day, and father to the Silas Renwick who now held Marietta's note. Bartholomew had speculated heavily and badly in cattle futures that summer, Finch wrote, and stood to lose the bank entirely unless he found capital fast and quiet. And so he had come to Finch with a proposition dressed up as a threat. Help him stage a robbery of the payroll silver, split the proceeds, and keep silent. Or Finch's own considerable gambling debts Bartholomew's bank happened to hold, would be called due within the week, ruining Finch and his family outright. Finch, weak and frightened and, by his own unsparing account, deeply ashamed, had agreed, but a robbery required a culprit, and Bartholomew Renwick had already selected one, a liveryman named Isaiah Cole, a freeman of quiet reputation who kept the coach horses and lived with his young daughter in a small house behind the stable, a man whose only crime, Finch wrote with visible anguish even 18 years later in the shake of his handwriting, was that he was black and poor, and therefore, in the calculus of men like Bartholomew Renwick expendable, Cole had been arrested within 2 days on planted evidence, a portion of the marked silver hidden in his stable loft while he slept, and had gone to territorial prison for it, protesting his innocence to a courtroom that had already decided, before he ever opened his mouth, exactly what sort of man he must be. He served 15 years. Finch's confession stated, in words that Marietta read 3 times to be certain she understood them correctly, that Cole had been released only the year before in 1885, broken in health and stripped of everything he'd once owned, and had died within 4 months of his release, in a rented room in Laramie, leaving behind a grown daughter named Ruth Cole, whom Finch believed still lived somewhere in the territory, though he had never found the courage to seek her out and tell her the truth while he lived. Finch himself had sealed the confession and the recovered portion of his own ill-gotten silver, money he could not bring himself to spend, behind the ticket window in the winter of 1868, intending, he wrote, to make it right eventually, to find Isaiah Cole and confess before a magistrate and clear the man's name. He never did. Shame, Finch admitted plainly, had made a coward of him for the rest of his life, and he had left Sable Flats not long after, and the confession evidently had simply waited, bricked into a wall, for someone patient enough and unafraid enough to go looking. Marietta sat with that lamp burning low around her for a long while, feeling something she could not entirely name, grief for a man she'd never met, a hot and unfamiliar anger toward the Renwick family that went beyond even her own grievance against Silas, and underneath it all, a dawning sense that the $9 she'd spent so foolishly had bought her something far heavier than an old building. It had bought her the truth about her town, and the truth, she understood even then, was a thing that would have to be carried carefully, because there were people in Sable Flats who had built their whole lives on the version of events that Obadiah Finch's confession now quietly, irrevocably contradicted. She spent the following weeks doing what she had always done best, looking closely at things other people had stopped looking at. She wrote to the Territorial Prison Records Office and confirmed Isaiah Cole's imprisonment and release exactly as Finch described. She made careful inquiries through the mercantile's mail contacts and a sympathetic circuit preacher, after a Ruth Cole, and after 5 weeks of patient letter-writing received word that a woman by that name was indeed living in Laramie, working as a laundress, having never married. Having spent much of her adult life, the preacher's letter noted gently, quietly convinced that her father's guilt was the one unshakable fact of her existence, the shadow she had organized her whole life around avoiding. Marietta wrote to her directly, carefully, not yet revealing everything, only that she had come into possession of papers concerning Isaiah Cole's case and would welcome the chance to speak with her. The strong box itself held $412 in silver coin, a considerable sum for that place and time, though far short, Marietta calculated from the old newspaper accounts she dug out of the mercantile's back room, of the full payroll amount, which suggested Bartholomew Renwick had kept the greater portion for himself, using Finch and the sealed confession as his insurance against ever being fully exposed. She did not touch the silver. She understood. with the same instinct that had once told her which bolt of cloth wanted to become a wedding dress and which wanted to become a christening gown, that this money did not belong to her, and that what she did with it next would determine whether her discovery healed something, or merely opened a wound and left it raw. It was around this time that Silas Renwick learned, no one was ever entirely certain how, though Marietta suspected the blacksmith's apprentice had spoken too freely at the saloon, that the widow he'd evicted had bought the old depot and had been seen carrying strange bundles of paper out of it by lamplight. He came to see her himself on a Sunday afternoon, standing on the sagging porch of the depot in a coat too fine for a dying town, and he asked her, with the same polite smile he'd worn the day he took her land, exactly what she thought she'd found in there. Marietta, who had by then read Obadiah Finch's confession enough times to know it nearly by heart, told him plainly that she'd found the truth about the payroll robbery of 1868, and watched something shift behind his eyes, not surprise. She noted carefully, but a kind of resignation, as though he had always known, on some buried level, that this particular debt might one day come due. He offered to buy the depot back from her that same afternoon, at 10 times what she'd paid, cash in hand, no questions asked, and when she declined, his politeness thinned considerably. Over the following weeks, he tried other approaches. He questioned her right to the deed through a lawyer, claiming an irregularity in the county's tax forfeiture proceedings. He spread word through the town that the widow Kestrel had gone strange with grief and was hoarding stolen money in that old building. He even, on one occasion that Marietta never spoke of publicly but which several townsfolk later confirmed under oath, attempted to have the depot condemned outright and demolished by the county on grounds of structural danger, a claim the county surveyor, to his credit, refused to certify. Sable Flats, weary and suspicious after years of decline, was divided. Some believed the widow was owed whatever she'd found. Others believed old Renwick money and new Renwick money alike had always known best. And a good many simply wanted the whole uncomfortable business to disappear before it cost them anything. It was Ruth Cole who finally tipped the balance. She arrived in Sable Flats in early June, a composed woman of perhaps 30 with her father's steady eyes, and Marietta met her at the depot and read her Obadiah Finch's confession aloud. Start to finish, in the same low afternoon light that had first revealed it. Ruth did not weep, not at first. She sat very still, the way people sit when a truth they've waited their whole life for finally arrives and proves too large to feel all at once. Then she asked quietly whether she might see the strongbox. Not for the silver, she said, but simply to see the thing her father's name had been buried under for 18 years. Marietta showed her, and told her the money was hers to decide the fate of. Not Marietta's, and it was Ruth Cole who suggested, in that same quiet voice, that the money ought to go towards something her father would have wanted, not restitution paid privately and forgotten, but something the whole town could see and remember. They called a public meeting at the church that had once been Marietta's own in July of 1886, and Marietta stood before Sable Flats, the same crowd that had laughed at her $9 bid 3 months earlier, and read Obadiah Finch's confession aloud in its entirety, with Ruth Cole seated in the front pew and the territorial newspaper's traveling correspondent, whom Marietta had quietly invited, taking careful notes in the back. She watched Silas Renwick's face throughout, and watched him leave before she finished the final page. The confession, corroborated by the prison records and by an aging former deputy who came forward afterward to admit he'd always doubted the evidence against Cole, could not be dismissed as an old woman's foolishness, however much some in town might have preferred it. Within the month, the territorial court reopened the matter, and though Isaiah Cole could not be brought back to hear it, his name was formally and publicly cleared, entered into the record as an innocent man wrongly convicted. A small mercy purchased 18 years too late, but not. Marietta insisted afterward, too late to matter. Silas Renwick did not go to prison. The statute and the years had seen to that, and his father was long past any earthly reckoning. But the bank's own directors, once the full story reached the territorial capital, quietly removed him from its management within the year. And the debts he'd used to strip families like Marietta's of their land came under a scrutiny that revealed more than one similar arrangement, several of which were, under public pressure, forgiven or renegotiated. It was not the dramatic justice of a courtroom, but it was, Marietta often said afterward, the kind of justice the real world tends to offer, slow, partial, and delivered mostly through the simple, unbearable weight of the truth being finally, plainly spoken where everyone could hear it. With Ruth Cole's blessing, Marietta used the $412. Along with contributions the newspaper story drew from sympathetic readers as far away as Cheyenne, to restore the depot itself, not as a stagecoach stop since the coaches had never returned, but as a schoolhouse and public library for the children of Sable Flats, the first the town had ever properly had, with a brass plaque by the door bearing Isaiah Cole's name and a short, dignified account of what he had suffered and what he had never done. Ruth Cole herself, at Marietta's invitation, came to live in Sable Flats and taught there for many years afterward, and the two women, bound by nothing more than a bricked-up window and a stranger's long-overdue courage, became as close as family for the rest of their lives. And so we return to where we began, to a 54-year-old widow standing outside a courthouse with $11.40 to her name, raising her hand to bid $9 on a building everyone else had already decided was worthless. We return to Marietta Kestrel because her story asks us to notice something we too easily forget, that the things the world discards are rarely discarded because they lack value, but because no one left has had the patience or the courage, or the plain stubborn attention to look closely enough to find it. Marietta did not set out to uncover a wrong committed 18 years before her purchase, and she did not set out to become the instrument of a dead man's overdue confession or a wronged man's overdue justice. She set out simply to survive with what little dignity remained to her, and in doing so, by looking closely at a thing everyone else had walked past, she gave a whole town back a piece of its honest history, and gave a grieving daughter back her father's good name. That, in the end, is the quiet arithmetic of her story. $9 spent in desperation, and a truth restored that no sum could ever properly price. Thank you for spending this time with us and with Marietta Kestrel's story. If it moved you, we'd be grateful if you'd share it with someone who might need reminding that overlooked things still hold their worth, and consider staying a while longer with us next time. Before you go, we'd love to know, what is a time you found real value in something the rest of the world had already written off? Tell us in the comments below. We read everyone. Until next time, stay close.